I'm happy to welcome you all to this 131st event organized by CIC since its inception. And this is the second of this new year, 2022. A very, very happy new year to all of you. The topic for discussion today is Tamil Nadu's major developmental challenges. How can policy respond? Our distinguished speaker is Dr. Arvind Subramanian. A warm welcome to you, sir. I would leave the task of introducing the speaker formally to Gopal, but I can't resist the temptation of sharing some interesting facets of our guest today and his connection to Namma Chennai. To tell you all, his Sonda Veedu is in Gopalapuram, and the house is about 90 years old. 7 to 8 generations of the family have resided here, and his mother still lives here. So a true blue-blooded Chennaiite is going to address us today at the Chennai International Center. He passed out of the DAV Higher Secondary School in Chennai, and I'm sure many of among our audience are also from the same alma mater. So as a true Chennai Vasi, he is very fond of Carnatic and Hindustani music. His review of late Keshav Desiraju's book on MS Subbulakshmi reflects his deep love for music. I would really recommend lovers of this genre of music to read his review before reading the book. I'll leave it to our guest. I do have some more snippets, but I would leave it to our guest if he so feels to share more interesting connections, especially his Gopalapuram connections and other connections with Namma with the audience. Thank you. Thank you all for supporting the efforts of CIC so far. It encourages us to redouble our efforts in the future. Exciting developments are taking place in the CIC, which will take it to greater heights in the years to come. Welcome once again. Happy New Year. And over to you, Gopal, for doing the further honors.
Thank you very much, Chandramouli. And again, Arvind, a very warm welcome to you back to CIC. I was going to say it's 4 years, but actually it's 3 because the new year has just begun. It was 2018 when you gave us your splendid talk. And it's great to have you here. For those of you who haven't kept track, Arvind is now a senior fellow at the Brown University's very well-renowned Watson Institute of International and Public Affairs. And of course, also keeps in touch with India through his work at Ashoka University, but most importantly for us, through his work with the Tamil Nadu government. The government has charted, the Chief Minister has charted a very ambitious course for a 1 trillion economy. I just want to also say that with this current 300 billion or so GDP, we're probably 1 trillion in purchasing power parity terms, but I think the Chief Minister means it in actual dollars of 1 trillion in the future. So, and Dr. Arvind Subramanian is one of the very eminent people like Dr. Raghuram Rajan and others who are helping the Chief Minister envision this very, very powerful vision in a state that is well known for its commitment to social justice and inclusion. And I'm sure we'll be hearing wonderful thoughts from him today on this subject. For those of you who remember his time as Chief Economic Advisor, I must also point you to a very nice post that Dr. Chandramouli shared with me when Mr. Arun Jaitley wrote a Facebook post called "Thank You, Arvind." I read it before this meeting, and I think it epitomizes his qualities in a very, very wonderful way. So thank you, Arvind, for making the time to be with us in our hometown. We look forward to your talk. Tamil Nadu is close to our hearts, and most importantly, it is our heart. And we would love to see how it is going to grow. Jude, who's joining us, Jude Sanith, is an anchor with CNBC. We've had the pleasure of having him with us before also. So welcome to you, Jude. And again, thank you for taking up the questions and answer moderation post Dr. Subramanian's talk. So without further ado, over to Dr. Arvind Subramanian.
Great. I want to thank CIC, Mr. Chandramouli, Gopal, Kapil, Jude, all of Nina for having me here. It's really wonderful to be here. And of course, it's wonderful to be here. Chennai is home for me. It's a pity I couldn't be part of the music season this year, which has been mostly virtual, I think. But if nothing else, that'll be a temptation to come back again and again. So let me just say that, when I left government 3.5 years ago, 2018, I wrote a book, and in the book, I ended by saying, we all believe Hindus in reincarnation, and if I were to be reincarnated again, what would my wish be after having been chief economic advisor to the government of India? I said my wish would be I would like to be chief economic advisor to all the states of India, as the kind of progression. If I've done good deeds, I go from being chief economic advisor in Delhi to chief economic advisor to all the states of India. But that wish has been partially fulfilled with the government having kindly invited me and others to be part of this Economic Advisory Council to advise the government. I think, by way of background, I think we need to step back and realize that, if anything, the last 2 to 3 years have proven to us that India needs a strong India. I don't know whether it needs a strong center, but that we can, debate. It certainly needs strong, dynamic states in India for a number of reasons. Partly to, maybe to check, Delhi. That could be one reason. Or just to be kind of a model and in terms of how to run things, and certainly Tamil Nadu is a model in some ways. It could be a magnet. For example, if it's dynamic, it attracts talent, it attracts people, it attracts capital, and so in India, where there's a kind of competitive federalism dynamic at play, states competing with each other, having Tamil Nadu as a model and a magnet is actually very, very important. So that's why when this opportunity came, and when a new government came to power with tremendous desire to reform and change things, it seemed like a no-brainer to be part of this effort. And so I'm also really grateful to the Chief Minister and Mr. Tyagarajan for having included me in this. Now, as I said, what we kind of don't fully appreciate when we think about Tamil Nadu as a state is that it's not easy to understand that when we talk about Tamil Nadu's development, for example, it is taking place in a particular context, and that context is Tamil Nadu is a state within a larger entity. So what it means is that when we talk about Tamil Nadu's development, we have to recognize upfront that this is not like New Delhi, because its levers are somewhat limited. The policy levers it has are somewhat limited. The fiscal resources it has are somewhat limited. So in a sense, our expectations of any state like Tamil Nadu could be, must deliver growth, must deliver, social justice, etc., etc. But, we kind of tend to forget that this is a state without all the levers of power that can be pulled by the center. And therefore, when we kind of try and both understand and prescribe for Tamil Nadu, we need to keep that in mind. The flip side of that is also that an entity like Tamil Nadu within a larger entity like India, I mean, the political accountability mechanisms are somewhat, you could say either they're attenuated or they are, in fact, even sharpened. But there is a sense in which we know that the way politics works at state levels, including Tamil Nadu, is very different from at the central level. There's much more focus at the center. Maybe accountability mechanisms are stronger. People focus more on what's happening there. The international press is focused there. So in some ways, because political accountability itself can get diluted, because state government politics tends to be a little bit more, even more presidential. If we think today that Indian politics is presidential, I mean, state level politics has been presidential for 50 years in India. In almost every state, politics is kind of some combination of presidential and dynastic politics in any case. So the accountability mechanisms are therefore also very different. And that should also be kept in mind when we talk about, the development challenges of a state. So having said that, by way of background, kind of let's plunge into just Tamil Nadu, which is, I mean, again, just for reference, Tamil Nadu is like a $10,000 per capita PPP economy. So if Tamil Nadu were a country, it would be an upper middle income country, a bit like Brazil, Chile, whatever, fairly affluent. And we would think of, we would certainly not think of Tamil Nadu as, we would think of India as a whole, or we would think of Uttar Pradesh or Bihar or whatever. We would think of Tamil Nadu quite differently, but because it's embedded in India, that tends to color us. $10,000 per capita is actually very good, especially where Tamil Nadu came from. And of course, Tamil Nadu is a model in terms of many, many social indicators in India, whether you think about fertility, stunting, educational indicators, etc. So by and large, our first order thing has to be that Tamil Nadu has been a very successful, by at least by certain standards, a very successful development model and a development experience. In fact, I was looking at the data between 1960 and today. Kind of above median compared to all the states. And, 50, 60 years later, it's amongst the top top 2-3 states. Now, having said that, of course, Tamil Nadu faces a lot of challenges, right? Now, it faces challenges partly because India faces challenges. And, I've just written a piece with Josh Feldman saying that, basically India kind of lost its way in the last decade. Many parameters, certainly in terms of growth, it slowed down considerably. And some of that has affected Tamil Nadu as well. But I think there is a sense in which Tamil Nadu has been further affected because, to be honest, in the last 7-8 years, governance deteriorated, much more political instability, and some of the dynamism that Tamil Nadu was associated with got lost along the way. And of course, there have been particular challenges for particular sectors in Tamil Nadu. For example, we were just speaking before, the small and medium enterprise sector has been, disproportionately affected. And that's because, it was first affected by the demonetization episode, then by the goods and services tax, and then by COVID. So it's like some sectors have experienced 3 shocks. And therefore, there are particular challenges that Tamil Nadu faces, and these have to be addressed. So let's talk a little bit about, firstly, what are the kind of growth kind of challenges and opportunities. Then we'll talk about social justice. Then I'll talk a little bit about 2 key macroeconomic challenges that Tamil Nadu faces. And then I want to come back to center-state relations between, Tamil Nadu and the South more broadly and the center. So Tamil Nadu's growth has lost its way. There's no question about it. Now, let me give you one indicator. Just let me give you one indicator. If you look at, the boom sector in India of the last 3 years, the boom sector, is the unicorn sector. The unicorn sector, cheap finance, India's tech and software advantage, and you're getting these companies very dynamic, using technology, using the new platform that the government has created, the Unified Payment Interface, JAM, whatever, and we're seeing a growth of these, rapid growth in many of these companies, and you know them better than I do, Ola, et cetera, et cetera. But if you look at the unicorns, about 80 of the unicorns, you ask yourself, finance, talent, technology, Tamil Nadu should be attracting these unicorns. But if you look at the unicorns, about 70, 80 of them, only 3 are Chennai based. They're all, so even in the most dynamic sector and something that you would expect Tamil Nadu to be very well in, Tamil Nadu actually lags behind. So there's something that's, needs to be picked up, revived, which is what this government is trying to do. But that alone is not going to be enough, because we know now again and again that if you want to reclaim a much more broad-based growth dynamism in Tamil Nadu, it has to be labor-intensive growth. And that's why I think that, in some ways, the clothing and the footwear and the auto sector are going to be, Tamil Nadu has had some advantage in this historically. It's lost some of that way, and therefore, getting investments back in these sectors, especially clothing, footwear, and this is, the opportunity has arisen because China is vacating space in these sectors. My colleague Shomitra Chatterjee and I have calculated that since about 2010, China has given up about $150 billion worth of exports because it's become richer and less competitive. And that gap, that vacuum is waiting to be filled. At the moment, that vacuum is being filled by Vietnam, Bangladesh, Indonesia, Thailand, and India is actually occupying very little of that space. And Tamil Nadu is really well placed to actually grab some of those opportunities. So a focus on labor-intensive growth, especially in these labor-intensive sectors and export-oriented labor-intensive sectors, is going to be very, very critical for Tamil Nadu going ahead. So I think that's on the both on the high-tech side, the unicorn side, and on the more inclusive growth side, we need, Tamil Nadu. That's I think the opportunity and challenge. And I think that's what this government is very focused on in kind of attracting this, filling in this space vacated by China. So that's on the growth side. What about on the social justice side? There's no question that the model of the political parties in Tamil Nadu, both DMK, ADMK, etc., and going back, of course, much earlier, has been, developing, enhancing social justice and building a social safety net for Tamil Nadu. And I think Tamil Nadu is just way ahead of most states in India, maybe barring Kerala, is kind of up there in terms of the programs it has for social welfare. I think part of what the government is trying to do is to see, what are still the gaps and the deficiencies in this broader social safety net, and it's trying to fill that, using technology, etc., etc. My own personal view here, and it's not the government's view, although it is there in the DMK's party manifesto, in the government's manifesto, is that to me, completing this social safety net would very much, kind of almost require having something like a universal basic income, so that everyone in Tamil Nadu has a certain income. It gives you a certain cushion, to realize yourself, to become entrepreneurs, to borrow, to spend on education, whatever. So that having that minimum, basic income is an idea that I think I would be very in favor of Tamil Nadu picking up in order to complete. So this is not to, replace the existing social safety net, but maybe to kind of complete it so that nobody really falls between the cracks and has the basic minimum, which Amartya Sen and others would say is necessary to realize your potential, for everyone to realize his or her potential as a kind of human being. So a universal basic income as the next step to kind of complete the social justice project is something that I would be very much in favor of. Now, of course, to do these things, you need resources. And especially if, you have the limited ability to raise resources, which I'm going to come. how do you generate these resources? So to me, the two, I would say, kind of macroeconomic challenges for Tamil Nadu, for example, would be, how do you raise resources in order to be able to both create this dynamic environment and also complete the social safety net, and also put its macroeconomic house, completely solid. As you know, Tamil Nadu has had somewhat high deficits. They're coming down, so it needs to kind of stabilize its debt to GDP ratio. Tamil Nadu, by the way, the interest payments or government interest payments as a share of revenue, which tells you how much of resources are being taken up just to pay interest and therefore not available for other expenditures. Tamil Nadu is actually very high. So Tamil Nadu needs to bring down its interest payments and deficit so that it can, do all the things that the state needs to do. And there, I think, for me, the two big areas for reform and kind of development would be, raising resources through, innovative property taxes, and addressing the problem, the chronic problem of the power sector in Tamil Nadu. As you know, the Tamil Nadu power sector is kind of bleeding. Massive losses. The debt of the utility company Tanketco is about. It's very, very. And it's one single contributing factor to destabilizing Tamil Nadu's, resource position and macroeconomic position. And so I think that needs to be worked on. There are some interesting, innovative ideas that could be done. I think one of the consequences would also be to reduce what the tariffs should be for manufacturing. Manufacturing is power intensive. If you could bring down manufacturing tariffs by, raising resources elsewhere in the power sector, I think that could also add to Tamil Nadu's competitiveness and attractiveness as an investment destination. Now, so the power sector and property taxes are, I think, the two real fiscal handles that I think Tamil Nadu will need to work on. And this is something we've been kind of discussing. Of course, the government will have to decide how to go ahead with these things. But just to give you one statistic on the property tax, Tamil Nadu is India's most urbanized state. And yet, the property tax that Tamil Nadu generates, something like 2,500 crores, is kind of a fraction of the other, even less urbanized states like Maharashtra, Karnataka, Gujarat, Telangana. So I think this is a kind of tax handle which is not regressive, which is progressive, and which could really be a way for Tamil Nadu to get its macroeconomic house in order, complete the social safety net project, as well as putting Tamil Nadu's macro position on a stable footing so that it can become a really attractive place for investment as well. Now, let me turn to, and of course, I'm happy to take questions in terms of what specifically may need to be done, but let's focus more on the big picture. I want to come before I end with, this really elephant in the room that's looming is center-state relations. Now, it's no secret that, center-state relations have been strained, not just on the GST, but more broadly in the last few years. We all know why that's happening. I think there's been a huge centralization of authority that has led to a lot of friction with the states, whether it was GST compensation, whether it was lockdown, whether it was vaccines, whether it's agriculture. Center-state relations are proving to be quite difficult and somewhat strained, and I think they need to be improved. But here's the question, though, right? How should a state like Tamil Nadu view this more broadly? Now, we know, for example, that in a few years' time, we're going to have this delimitation commission, and the southern states and Tamil Nadu as well, they're going to lose political power relative to some of the more populous states in the north. So that's a big kind of powder keg looming in the distance. But on top of that, if you look at the fiscal arrangements within India, and I've been doing a lot of research on that. At some stage, I will write about it in more detail. Is that if you look at the fiscal arrangements in India, it is the case that there is some amount of redistribution from richer southern and western states to the poorer states of the north, and especially the Hindi heartland. Now, I think we need to be careful here. I think we're all part of a union. Therefore, some amount of redistribution is kind of necessary, inevitable, and part of being part of this common project that is India. So all federal systems have some amount of redistribution, and I think that's fine. But I think what is kind of a little bit more distinctive about the Indian case is that the magnitude of redistribution, the kind of clear flows from certain states to other states kind of almost permanently, and the fact that this redistribution doesn't seem to be showing any sign of declining over time. So I think politically, it's not very easy to sustain a fiscal arrangement where you find fading political power on the one hand, but kind of high and rising fiscal responsibility and fiscal redistribution to other states. Now, if this happens on top of a broader political context in which we have centralization of power, we have all these language issues coming back to the fore, I think that's not going to be, it's not going to be easy to sustain in the long run. So I think that, and this is something that, the Finance Minister, Mr. Tyagarajan, has, taken up. And, whatever the resolution has to be, I think it has to be the case that some, fundamental revisiting of the fiscal arrangements so that some of these responsibilities, obviously there will be some redistribution. I think, there could be some gradual phasing down and some rejigging of these fiscal arrangements. I think that could be contemplated going forward. On the GST itself, I feel that it's one of those very successful reforms, even if it's taking time to show that it's going to be a very useful reform. I think there too, there is scope for more constructive engagement between the center and the states to come up with a GST that is, simpler, has slightly higher rates. And, my strong view is that all the controversy around the GST is in part because the GST has, for some completely extraneous reasons like COVID, et cetera, it hasn't delivered the buoyancy of revenue that everyone was hoping to be. So the flip side of what I'm saying is that if the GST could once again start becoming buoyant, through the kinds of things that I've been saying, then I think some of the friction associated with GST will kind of naturally also, fade away. So this is a case where I think there is a way forward. I think we can see how this can be done. But I do think that the whole GST discussions are a kind of a prelude or a microcosm of a larger set of arrangements where it's been far too one-sided, far too big, far too permanent, without any signs of things, responsibilities declining for states like India, which need to be addressed. So I think, and especially with political power going to change with the delimitation commission, I think these are some areas that I think need to be revisited. So just to kind of summarize, and I'd be happy to take questions going forward. Is Tamil Nadu is a kind of development success, but I think there are challenges looming, like for the country more broadly. I think there are areas where I think under strong, effective leadership and through imaginative policy making, we can have a change. I think one of the things that all of us in the advisory group really have been very happy with is how open this government has been to ideas. I mean, it's not that we have any monopoly on wisdom or ideas, but just to be able to engage and discuss and share ideas and learn from each other. It's been a terrific learning experience, I would say, hopefully for all sides. And so, there is a sense of, I think, promise here at a critical juncture for Tamil Nadu, where I'm very, I'm hopeful and confident that some of these challenges can be met, because there are lots of opportunities as well. And Tamil Nadu is kind of very well placed to be able to take advantage of some of these opportunities. So let me stop there and let me take questions, whatever they are,
All right, can I proceed with questions then, or would Mr. Chandramouli like to say a few words before we go ahead for the next session?
Go ahead, Jude. I think it's been a very interesting session. A lot of questions have been thrown up, and I'm sure there are already 2 questions in the question answer box. And
absolutely.
We have one in the chat box too. And
yes,
so
yes, absolutely. And I've taken note of these questions, and I will get to them in just a bit. Before we get started, I have to ask you, Mr. Subramaniam, what has the experience been like really on the Economic Advisory Council? This is still a new government. May 2021 wasn't too long, too far behind us. What is it like working with Mr. Stalin, as a new chief minister? I know for a fact that you are in some esteemed company there with the likes of Dr. Rajan and Esther Duflo, Mr. Tyagarajan himself. Give us some insight into what the workings are like as part of this Ivy League of sorts in terms of an economic advisory panel.
Yeah, see, I think that it's a great question, and I think first of all, let me just draw a caveat that all the action, all the hard work, the hard decisions are made by, people on the ground, the politicians and the government. So, the so-called Ivy League thing is there as a kind of, providing ideas, helping in whatever small ways we can. So I think, to kind of think of us as providing magic bullets, and therefore, A, we will provide bullets, and B, they will be easily implementable. I don't think we should harbor any such exaggerated, I certainly don't want an exaggerated sense of my own self-importance in this whole thing. But having said that, it's just, so we've had a lot of, each of us individually have had bilateral dealings with Mr. Tyagarajan and the government. We've had 2, collective meetings with the Honorable Chief Minister, Mr. Stalin. And, on this trip, each of us has met, or, in my case, we're going to meet himself. And we've been having lots of meetings with government, with Mr. Tyagarajan. And frankly, the meetings we've had today, for example, was super exciting and, super interesting. It was really really Jean Rez and I and Mr. Narayanan were with Mr. Tyagarajan, discussing social justice, discussing power, discussing GST, and things more broadly. And it's been really very, very, very exciting and intense and so on. And so there's a huge receptivity on the part of the government, and that makes us in turn very excited to be part of that. So, but as I said, I mean, I always used to say, when I was CEA, I said, I'm the chief economic advisor, not the chief political implementer. So the economic advisor, the task is quite easy. The political implementer's task is much more difficult. But the openness and the receptivity, which frankly some people think is missing in other parts of the country, I think to have that here is really a wonderful thing. And we've had terrific meetings, both individually, bilaterally, collectively as well. And this is an ongoing process. We're going to be having this over the next months and hopefully years. And so a part of me wants to say that if good things happen, give us credit. If bad things happen, blame the government. When in fact it's exactly the opposite. I think all the credit should go to the government because they're in the tough spot of actually doing these things.
Right. So with no further ado, then let me get down to some of the questions. And the first one I'm taking up, and remember, questions are coming through both in the chat and the Q&A box. But if you'd like to send in your questions in a way that Mr. Subramaniam will be able to answer them in a more efficient manner, do drop it in the Q&A box, because that's the one-stop shop for all your questions that will be answered. But the first question comes from Sanjeevi Venugopal, and he asks, freebies have become a big disaster for revenue, and more than freebies, it's the leakages that are taking place in Tamil Nadu. What is your advice to policy makers? Now, before I get you to answer this, Mr. Subramaniam, I remember in the very first interview that Mr. Tyagarajan gave CNBC TV 18 after he assumed charge as Finance Minister of Tamil Nadu, he made a very interesting quote. He said, one man's freebie is another person's essential social spending. So while we are talking about, and while there has been, plenty of discourse in the past, and I can tell you this as a reporter from the ground, in terms of how freebies have kind of spoiled the state, spoiled, the demographic here in a sense as to, bring about a sense of expectation. Do you feel freebies or essential social spending, to use another term, is a precursor of sorts to universal basic income? Are they, in a sense, are they linked in a marriage that cannot be broken?
See, I kind of, look, there are some, I would agree with almost most of what Mr. Tyagarajan said, that, one man's freebie is another man's, essential requirement. And so let me kind of make a kind of historic, reference here. When, Tamil Nadu first introduced its midday meal scheme, God knows how many decades ago, I remember the reaction of most people like us. Well, we were all much younger, and even the World Bank, they said, this is a freebie. This is like giving stuff away, and I remember how attacked the midday meal scheme was. It was really considered a real reckless, irresponsible freebie, right? And I was just mentioning this, just a few, maybe a month ago, there's been definitive research which says that the midday meal scheme not just in Tamil Nadu, but of course it was emulated elsewhere, whatever, has had amazing impacts on the cognition, not just on the generation that got the midday meal scheme, but the next generation as well, in terms of cognitive impact. So I think, therefore, when we, tend to, kind of brand all these things with the thing of freebie, I think we have to be a little bit careful, because there are some things which are, genuinely, not freebies at all, and absolutely essential to, us as basic citizens and so on. So I think the challenge, therefore, has to be that how do we make it more efficient, using technology, for example, using direct benefit transfers? How do we make it less leakage, more efficient, more effective? I think that's something that I think the government would be very open to, to doing, so that we can curb leakage and so on. Now, having said that, I mean, there are things which are freebies, which are, one should say, which are freebies that should not be given and that should over time be addressed. For example, I think everyone would agree that, the power subsidy, for example, is something that, has to be tackled. Why? Because it has so many other negative consequences that, water tables decline, there's overuse of things, it pollutes, it contributes to global warming, it contributes to carbon pollution. And therefore the question should be not, freebie bad, which maybe in part this one is, but how do you find more effective ways and less wasteful ways of providing a certain social safety, minimum social safety net? So that's the way in which even the power subsidy, for example, has to be addressed. I mean, yes, there's a lot of stuff that I think, but can we do it in a way that protects people, at least the very poor people? And in some ways, the universal basic income idea is just taking that one more step. What it's saying is the following, that you have all these multiple schemes, a lot of leakage, a lot of overlap. Let's take stock of what all of that is. And can we even rationalize that into something that's, provides a minimum, well targeted, with minimal leakage? Because remember, those are the advantages of a universal basic income. By the way, my idea of a universal basic income is, and just to clarify that, is what I call a quasi-universal basic income, where remember, what we do today is we target in beneficiaries. You're poor, you get X. You're this caste, you get X, right? So you have to identify and target in beneficiaries. Under a universal basic income, what happens is, what I would like to do is to say, you give it to everyone except those at the very top. So you don't target in people, you exclude people at the top. So that's why I call it a quasi-universal basic income. And it's better targeted. And even it's easier to exclude rich people than it is to identify poor people. I think you just have to pick up the roster of the Chennai International Center and say, let's leave these guys out of a universal basic income. Ain't that hard? It ain't that hard. But but finding poor people is very hard. So that's the sense in which the whole freebie discussion has to be some is not freebie, some is very good. Well, some is freebie, and therefore, how do you find better ways? But the underlying objective of the freebie, which is providing a minimum so that people can live decent lives, honorable lives, where you can realize yourself. I think that should be the way we engage in this discussion.
You mentioned something very interesting there as to, quasi-universal basic income, identify the top layer, exclude them, and provide for everybody else. And, it's very interesting because a lot of people, much like Lakshmi Narayanan, has also posted a question here, suggests perhaps giving coupons for food, water, electricity, and education, even telecom, perhaps, to the bottom 20% of the families that are probably poorer than the rest. So do you subscribe to excluding the top layer, or perhaps identifying and including the bottom layer instead? Which of these approaches do you feel would be, a more rational look at universal basic income?
You see, Jude, it's a great question, but remember, the history of India in terms of social schemes for the poor has been very much this manic attempt to identify the poorest. And that is, in fact, what has led to difficulty of targeting, leakages. When Rajiv Gandhi famously said, out of 1 rupee, only 10 ends up or whatever, it was precisely because we were desperately trying to do this, let's find the poorest. In fact, when the Congress came out with that Nyay scheme, I was not in favor of it precisely because it goes back to that old thing of, let's find the poor. Now here's I think why it's very important. Your question now is actually very important. You see, in the old days, we used to think you identify the poorest and you're done. But in the modern era, what happens is I may be relatively well off today, but I could get an income shock, I could get a health shock, and I become poor. So the notion of who is, the bottom 20 in terms of thing is going to change with respect to shocks. And therefore, if you fix it at a given point in time, over time that changes. And so you're going to lose out. Whereas with the universal basic income, the fact that you've excluded those who clearly know are not going to be affected by these shocks ensures that actually your coverage will be fairer and will keep up with the times in a way that this, oh, let me find the poorest for all times and I've solved the problem, will not. And that's been our experience, frankly.
In keeping with fiscal handles as well, to go about finding means and ways of raising revenue, you mentioned that two opportunities that lie for the state are the property tax sector and also the power sector. Let's start with power reforms. In fact, Ramakrishnan Kalyanaraman writes, what would your suggestion be for the power sector reforms in the state? Is charging for agricultural power supply and increasing retail household power tariff the way out? And in a similar vein, if you could also elaborate on how best you feel property tax can be optimized to ensuring that we as a state, with all our urbanization, get the best from it, both power and property tax. How do we go about moving these fiscal levers to make the most of their presence?
Yeah. So see, first of all, I don't want to get too technical here. The audience wants to be, but let me see. First of all, I think we have to, understand that the fact that we haven't done this for 50 years, not just in Tamil Nadu, but in other states as well, tells you that there's a serious problem here. You don't have, 50 years of free power in agriculture in Tamil Nadu and in every other state for no reason. We know that, there's a kind of underlying political dynamic here, which just politicians find it very difficult to address. So I would not want to jump into this and, say, oh, I know better than the government, what the politics is. They'll have to figure out the politics of this, which is, very difficult. But I think there are, ideas. Let me give you a couple of ideas. I'm just throwing these things out. So you take the petroleum subsidy, for example, that used to be there in the center, throughout the 2000s. The UPA2 government actually did something very, very interesting, which is what a lot of behavioral theories suggest. What they did was they said, instead of making these dramatic changes in prices, they just increased prices, 5 rupee at a time, small incremental but frequent changes over time, so that consumers don't feel it. It happens gradually, incrementally, and then once you get to some kind of eliminating the subsidy, and then you let prices go up and down. The best way to depoliticize a price is to let it go up and down. The best way to politicize a price is not to move it and to make it a big object of attention. Small changes over time, and let it go up and down. People accept it, and while doing this, protect the poorest. For example, every state in India now says the first 100 units is free, or first 200 units is free, whatever. And maybe that's fine, but at least over and above that, everyone pays at whatever thing. So I think there are ways of doing that, depoliticizing small frequent changes, making it go up and down, preserving some minimum. That's one way of address. And there are examples. We've done it in other sectors in our country as well. So maybe we should be thinking of that as well. The other thing that I find is that, if you look at the power tariff schedule in Tamil Nadu today, which is actually amongst the better amongst all the states, I mean, you look at the power tariff schedule, it is a nightmare. If at the number of categories there are, it will say, power to government institutions X, government to private institutions Y. If you do less than 100 X, 100 to 150 Y, 150 to 200 Y, power loom Z, so it is unbelievably complex. And we don't have to have this complexity. We can preserve our basic principles of equity. So I think there are ways around that, which I think can be done. But, it's not going to be politically easy. I think they have to find ways of doing that, but it can be done. And I think it should be tried. On the property tax, also much more, again, very political, very difficult. But I think there are two ways of going about it, I think. Yeah. One is, I think we just need to get the technical and the data side done. I would say, just to be provocative, I think the Chennai Corporation should, all the Chennai International Center members, all their housing properly catalogued. What is the market value of the land? Get data on, in boat club, last month, this property went for 100 crores, so that's part of your database. We know what property values are, and build up the kind of data side, the inventory side, and then start with that. And then similarly, be gradual in how you address this. For example, start with some cities, not all of Tamil Nadu. Maybe just start with Chennai and Madurai, for example, and then, or even within, just say start with Chennai and then get the inventory and then get the data, think about, small incremental changes over time. But on the property tax, I think there is a kind of deeper issue here, which I was talking about. There are two deeper issues about property tax, right? First, it's implemented by the third tier, not by the state government, formally. So you need better governance at the third tier, and you need the third tier and the second tier to work with each other. I mean, just to give you, again, a controversial example. Suppose the DMK is in power in the state and the Chennai Municipal Corporation is ADMK, right? It's going to be problematic, right? They're going to be, difficulty. So, there's that to navigate as well. So I think that, and of course, you see, you also have to ask yourself, why do members of the Chennai International Center resist paying property taxes? For example, and there is a deeper sense in which people are unwilling to pay because they feel the services that are being provided are not, good. So, this is just money down a black hole. So there's a kind of chicken and egg problem, right? Services have to be better delivered for people to have the confidence that, the money that they're paying for these services is going to be well spent. So there is a reason why, property taxes have not been so kind of buoyant, because it is a tricky and politically difficult problem, which has to be tackled at these multiple levels.
Right. I also have to ask you, perhaps on a more lighter note, you spoke about how there has been, a dearth of unicorns really from Tamil Nadu and Chennai, especially given the national context, of having close to 80 unicorns in all. And I sometimes wonder, is it the weather in Chennai that's preventing as many unicorns from, taking form and shape in the city? You look at a San Francisco, you look at a place like Bangalore that plays host to startups. It's almost a natural destination of sorts, much kinder on the weather front. Do you feel that could perhaps be one of the reasons? Because there's no other talent here. There is ample technology and room for technological development. So what then you feel ails the startup and the unicorn sector as far as Chennai is concerned?
Let me begin with an even lighter vein. I would say that if Tamil Nadu could, for every chess grandmaster that Tamil Nadu produces, there should be a commitment to create one unicorn. Matching, called a matching strategy. Grandmaster, it has to be matched by a unicorn that's created, because we're producing so many chess grandmasters. But coming back to your a lighter vein, you see, I kind of think that the greater Delhi area attracts many more NCR than Tamil Nadu. I mean, is the weather in Delhi, is the pollution really that much better than Tamil Nadu? Delhi is, 4 months of the year. I think I'm surprised Delhi is not driving away investors and unicorns given the state of its pollution, right? So in that sense, compared to some of the, Bengaluru infrastructure is not that great. I mean, the weather may be good, but the infrastructure is, it's kind of falling apart, right? I think the fact is that Tamil Nadu has a lot of advantages. The talent, if you look at the diaspora, the Tamilian diaspora in tech, in finance, I mean, we have huge natural advantages, and I think this is an opportunity. I don't think the weather. By the way, I love Chennai weather. I think it's very healthy weather, and at least 4 months of the year it's fantastic. Compared to Delhi, it's much better. So I don't think weather per se. See, I think there are agglomeration effects that Bangalore benefits because, and Mumbai benefit because, once you've done 10, you already have 10. 11 is very easy because they already have the 10. I think in some sense, Chennai has to break through. You get 5, 6, then it will kind of snowball. You create the agglomeration effect. And we haven't done that as yet. And that requires maybe a little bit of work on the part of government, working with investors and so on.
Right. It's all about creating that momentum, and let's hope that that build-up happens in the near future. Ranganathan asks, how feasible is labor-intensive industries when Tamil Nadu is already presumably reliant on migrant labor? Is this going to be sustainable in the future? Labor-intensive sectors, much like footwear, automobiles, the ones that you mentioned, given the migrant situation here, especially noticed and during the first wave of COVID when there was a mass migration from cities to villages.
I think that's a very good question. See, I think that probably Tamil Nadu's niche is not going to be on, the really 8,000, 10,000 rupee textile clothing worker. I think Chennai is slightly in the higher range. Tamil Nadu itself in the higher range. So I think, for example, 50, I'm just making these numbers up, 15, 20,000 rupee monthly earning. There, I think the productivity could be good enough to sustain that level of wages, which would attract even local labor as opposed to migrant labor. But that's a question that I think needs to be addressed. I mean, I think it's possible to do that. I think what you're right is, if it's very, very low skill intensive labor, maybe more of the demand will be met by migrant labor rather than local labor. But I think there are niches, where Tamil Nadu can easily occupy, where the productivity and the wage profile can be matched to generate that kind of employment. So it's probably not going to be in the lowest skill category.
Right. You pointed out, sir, about how there's a vacuum of sorts in China, wherein players are moving out, and there is of course a $150 billion worth of opportunities there. What do you think Tamil Nadu can do? Balamurali Radhakrishnan asks, to seize on these opportunities and attain some leverage on this front in terms of filling this vacuum.
I think basically government, industry, and foreign investors have to work together. And I think that if the power situation can be kind of stabilized, if the basic governance structure is people have confidence, that there's going to be stable government, efficient government, relatively clean government, and then work with domestic and international investors to create the climate to attract this investment. Because in the $150 billion that's fleeing China, and probably the unicorn sector even more, is whatever's happening. See, remember, there are two sets of people who are now fleeing China. The first set, because China was becoming naturally richer, wages were rising, so all the low skill stuff was leaving China. Right, that was happening from about 2012, 2013. That was, so that's one chunk of opportunity. The next chunk is a result of what Xi Jinping is doing to, domestic Chinese industry, which is also in the slightly higher tech, tech and fintech and services end. So now there are opportunities being created, in that segment as well. And, Tamil Nadu is actually also well placed to attract those things. So I think there has to be some kind of, maybe some breakthrough with one or two, early and big investments, whatever. And then that could kind of snowball into, because remember, and there are people here who know more than me, On the auto sector, we've suffered a bit of a setback, right? I mean, we used to be the most, dynamic. We used to be the auto hub of the world for auto parts and things. We've lost some of that dynamism, right? And so, how do we gain that back with China vacating export space? Is something that I think, I would say if government and industry could sit together and work with foreign investors as well, I think that would be the way to do it.
Mr. Subramanian, you've spoken so much about possible solutions to increasing or improving rather the fiscal health of the state. You spoke about levers like property tax, like the power sector. But I believe Shankar has a very pertinent question when he asks, while most of these solutions are great, will they eventually or possibly, at the risk of perhaps sounding a tad pessimistic, fall or fail rather on the rock of electorate acceptability or political will? Is that the most crucial part of the equation towards, ensuring that most of these solutions or suggestions or proposals actually take form and shape? Or is there something different this time around which can ensure that almost all these proposals of the Economic Advisory Council, some of which you're sharing with us here, can actually go about being implemented this time around?
I think the simple answer, Jude, to that is political will is the starting point. I mean, political will, nothing happens, right? And therefore, I think at least some of us are hoping, and that in fact this time around there is a new dispensation with the political will to and after 5-7 years of basically Tamil Nadu languishing and treading water for a long time, the sense that there's you've kind of broken with that, at least the immediate past. I think that's the kind of sense of hope and optimism. And frankly, if that political will is not there, and you see that, then we're not in business. That's so the political will is absolutely critical. And my sense is that at least for now, I mean, political will seems to be there in spades. So let's hope. But we also have the way to the tempering of expectations is not about political will or not, is about, even given the political will, what is a realistic expectation on your outcomes, because things are not going to change overnight. It's a sense of realism, kind of maybe optimistic realism about what the delivery can be, what the outcomes can be. So that's where I would say the moderation and the realism should come in.
Right. And it's also because, for the fact remains that tariff, for instance, has been a politically sensitive topic, as Sanjay Vijaykumar points out, especially here in Tamil Nadu. In fact, when the DMK was in the opposition, any move to increase property taxes or power tariffs were actually opposed. So, given that the tables have turned and this party is now in the government, will these reforms actually stand the test of possibility, given the history of opposition that they've had to endure in the past?
Isn't Kamaraj famous for saying "Ahatum Parkala"?
I'll need to check on that. I'm not entirely sure.
I think he. So Parkalam. I mean, let's see. I mean, I think we should. Yeah, that's what I said. Yeah. That's what I said, Kamaraj. So I think that we'll have to wait and hope, and all of us have to work towards it. But for the moment, at least, I'm optimistic. For the moment, at least, yeah. Right.
Tamil Nadu also has this tryst that it has kept with renewable resources, especially on the energy front. And I'm given to understand that perhaps that's why Subramani Mahadevan has a question. What are your thoughts on converting all electrical irrigation pump sets into solar pump sets, with prices of solar actually being competitive now and with almost 75% subsidies from the center? Tamil Nadu has almost 16% of agri pumping sets in the country. So thoughts on converting all irrigation pump sets into solar pump sets? Is that something that could be fiscally viable?
I think there are lots of ideas on solarization of agricultural pumps that are out there. I think these are good ideas. One idea would be, and this, my friend and co-author Devesh Kapoor has been, very keen on this. So for example, supposing you were to give pumps to farmers, right? At the moment, they get free power, they run the pump 24/7, right? So, and we know what that leads to, right? Suppose you gave them solar pumps, right? And you said, if you generate extra power, the grid will buy your power, right? So you use it for as long as you want, but for the rest of the time, you're actually getting income from this, not just being a drag on this, but actually earning money based on this. So you it becomes like a double benefit. So I think the solarization of agriculture is actually an idea whose time has come. I think many places are considering it, and it's certainly well worth considering, because you can actually say not just use this instead of your pump for your own water, but actually over and above that, generate it and feed the tariff, and we'll pay you for it.
Right. Just shifting focus a tad bit from the economic discourse, Samyukta Kannan has a rather interesting question, and it has to do with citizenry. What role do you think the state government and the Economic Advisory Committee have in mind for Tamil Nadu citizens to participate in the development process? Are there plans to take inputs of local researchers, businessmen, civic bodies in going about charting out a development course for the state? Is that something that is very much on the cards?
Yeah, actually, one of the more exciting things that's being discussed, and Jean Drez is, of course, one of my colleagues, and he's actually been in the forefront on exactly this idea. How do you make, basically improving the accountability mechanisms, improving RTI, instituting grievance redressal, proactive disclosure. And in fact, this has been a core part of the discussions that Jean has been kind of in the forefront of. And in fact, even today's discussions, centered around that. Because I think it's a really it's a point that we forget, at least some of us forget, which Jean never does, to his great credit, is that development is as much about participation and accountability and transparency, people having voice and being given voice. And so the process in some ways is as much development as whatever outcomes that might be. And in fact, this is a big part of the discussions of the Economic Advisory Council, and a lot of credit to Jean Drez for actually spearheading these initiatives. And the government is very receptive to these ideas as well.
Right. Just the last couple of questions then before we close the session, Mr. Subramaniam. I believe Ranganath Krishna has a very interesting question. He believes there's an elephant in the room that nobody is acknowledging or talking about, and that's corruption, both coercive and collusive. What do you think can be done to get rid of or perhaps reduce at least coercive corruption, which impacts people and business?
Yeah, so it is the elephant in the room. It is a kind of, but it's also something that and I'm not evading the question. It's not something that a lot of us have a lot of clear policy, advice to give on this, right? It's not as if you can say, Mr. X, stop taking bribes. Mr. Y, don't harass people. So I think it has to very much come from the top. I think it has to be, a kind of signal has to be sent saying that, this kind of both coercive and collusive thing. See, let's be honest, it's never going to go away. I mean, the way we have set up our politics, our elections, all these things, it's not going to go away. The question is, what are the things that, the minimal amount of corruption that needs to be eliminated to make citizens' lives better and to actually create a climate for investors, both the small and medium. So there's no one policy, I can't tell you, yes, we must reduce pollution, but that's motherhood and apple pie. But how do you do it? I don't know. The obvious answer is, the people in power have to set examples, etc., etc. And so, some things we can do. We can say things like, simplify, make things simpler. Improve, the kind of thing that Jean is doing, improve, accountability, transparency, e-governance, e-procurement, direct benefit transfers. All of these are all part of and some of this is happening, especially direct benefit transfers. For example, you eliminate a lot of middle layers. So it's kind of all these things that have to go into, reducing both coercive and collusive corruption.
Right. So one last question then before we end, and this one is, one that I have myself, and I've also reported a fair bit of this from Tamil Nadu. You spoke about two important fiscal levers, property tax, and you mentioned another one as well. But I have to ask you, one of the fiscal levers that Tamil Nadu has quite efficiently exercised for the last 2 decades is a monopoly over the sale of alcohol in the state. TASMAC is one of the largest revenue generators for the state of Tamil Nadu. Also, mostly at the risk of seeing heavy virtue signaling from several people. In fact, several governments have also, toed the election line, promising prohibition, phased prohibition. But there is, of course, a lot of talk and discourse on the need to implement some sort of prohibition, if not complete. And most governments have actually promised to go about bringing this or making this happen. What is your take when it comes to monopoly of alcohol sales in Tamil Nadu, given that it is very much a cash cow? Is prohibition the way to go? Do you feel the government should perhaps stay away from that discourse, at least for the moment, given the kind of revenues being generated by the sector?
See, I think you're kind of mixing up two questions, right? One is objective and the other is instruments. These are two different questions. So objective, do you want to eliminate alcohol consumption? That's a policy question. Frankly, I think that's a very political question, to which my views are not worth anything. I think it's a much bigger. There are those. Remember, here there's a kind of classic collision between two philosophical values, right? Or rather, it's a clash between one philosophic value and a kind of clear social consequence. The philosophical value is, what I do in my bedroom is my business. What I do in my bar is my business. Nobody else's business, right? I mean, that's the classic liberal, as long as I don't impact others. That's the classic liberal view. But then, if you have evidence, which is what people like Nitish Kumar, Yogendra Yadav, and others have been saying, but no, there are these consequences for others from your drinking, and therefore it needs to be regulated, right? And so it's kind of a clash between trying to reconcile two objectives, which I think is by definition a political and a social choice, not a technical choice. And different governments and different will make these different choices. So my preference on this is not very important. However, on the instrument, I think one can kind of, just from first principles, say that for basically anything, a monopoly is not the best instrument. Whatever your objective is, a monopoly is not the best instrument, right? And therefore, I would have a kind of, as an economist who kind of thinks about these things, have a slightly, slightly more considered view on the instrument than on the underlying objective, which is very political.
All right. On that note, thank you so very much for joining us.
One last question from me, Arvind. You mentioned about the challenges of raising resources, and property tax as an innovation can be used as a mechanism to raise resources. My question to you is, as Chief Economic Advisor, you've seen the functioning of 30 states at a telescopic level. Why can't some of the best practices of other states automatically be transmitted to other states, particularly on raising of resources? Why should each state look at their own atmosphere situation in a very isolated fashion?
The simple answer is that, the Bangalore voter doesn't vote in Tamil Nadu, right? So that's the simple answer to your question. But no, I do think maybe it's, the politics and the circumstances of states vary quite enormously. And so that's the sense in which I think there are some things you can translate, for example, how these are documented, what technology you're using to, say, latest satellite technology, whatever, all that can be common, right? Because that's a kind of minimum platform you do this. But, should it be, 1 rupee per this or 3 rupees per this, that doesn't easily translate. People are poorer in one state, richer in another state. Some places services is better, so people are willing to pay more. So on that, I don't think one should, necessarily say what happens in one state should translate. There's some things which do, but some things which may not.
All right. On that note, thank you so very much, sir, for taking these questions and for helping understand a little bit more about the economy and the way Tamil Nadu is poised for growth. I believe your views and your proposals will go a long way in helping us all understand the economy and the makings of it a whole lot better. So thank you so very much for doing this on behalf of the Chennai International Center. I greatly appreciate it. Thank you so very much. And over to Mr. Chandramouli right now.
Thank you, Jude, and thank you, Arvind, for that very. It can go on and on. The questions are just coming in, and I'm sure a lot of people would feel a bit disappointed that we can't go on and answer each and every question. But I think the broad sense that Arvind has conveyed has reached everyone, and I'm very thankful to Arvind to have agreed to address us today. Over to Gopal now to do the concluding honors.
Really nothing further to add. Thank you so much, Arvind, and for your very balanced and yet challenging remarks. I think I love that fine line between not talking about the political agenda of prohibition, but talking about the practical idea of monopolies, and the focus on whether we should focus on the unicorn sector, and particularly we should more focus on the labor creation sector. For a person who comes from the unicorn sector like me, of course, that's interesting to hear. I think the questions are so many, and I think we can ever send Dr. Subramanian a copy of this, Mr. Chandramouli. That would be very, very useful. Fabulous questions. I've been eyeballing those questions, and I think they can actually make for a meeting of the Economic Advisory Commission of the state, is what I feel. And that shows the richness of this dialogue that has taken place today in the form of those questions that are present. Jude, as always, your enormous ability to ask questions in such a nice way and to fold in multiple questions into one is always on display today also. So thank you, Jude, and thank you, Arvind.
Thanks a lot for having me. It's a real pleasure, and if you keep inviting me, I'll keep coming. So love to do this again at some point. Yeah, the questions were great, Jude. You were terrific, and even though I couldn't see all the audience, I could sense that from the questions that people wanted to take this further. So I'm happy, and I hope we can do it again. Yeah.
Thank you. In person and with a dinner too, Arvind, next time. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Teishadam and Vadumanga. Oh, that's the.
And for all our so many Andhra members, we'll throw in an avocado too. Don't worry.
Avocado.
Yeah. Thank you.